Have you ever really paused to look at a map and just think how much of our world is actually water?
It's overwhelming when you consider it.
Right. And how much of everything, history, trade, conflict, has played out on those huge blue expanses? Today, we're doing a deep dive into geopolitics and naval history. And we're guided by someone who's really lived it for almost 4 decades.
Yeah, we're moving beyond just, lines on a map. We're looking at how the oceans literally shape civilizations, our daily lives even. And we're drawing heavily from Admiral James Stavridis' book, Sea Power, The History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans.
Okay.
Our goal here is really to pull out the Admiral's key arguments, his insights, those vivid details he includes, to help you get why the sea has always been so incredibly important and why it still is.
Exactly. So get ready for some pretty surprising facts, amazing historical stories, and basically a trip across the most important waterways on the planet.
You'll definitely get a fresh perspective on this liquid world that covers most of our globe.
And connects to us in some pretty deep ways, as it turns out.
Yeah.
So Stavridis kicks off the book with this really profound thought about the ocean being timeless. I mean, imagine spending almost 11 years of your life out there, deep ocean, no land in sight like he did. What kind of viewpoint does that give you? Why start there?
Well, a really key idea he brings up is how our own connection to water kind of mirrors the planet itself.
How so?
He points out this striking parallel, a human baby is about 70% water. And guess what? The Earth's surface is also about 70% water.
Huh. Never thought of it quite like that.
Right. He calls it this instinctive, almost primordial pull the oceans have on us. A basic connection tying all of us, all humanity, to the sea.
And he says going to sea doesn't matter if it's a warship or a cruise ship. It feels like stepping into another dimension.
Yeah, an ocean away from land.
But still connected to this unbroken line of sailors throughout history. I mean, think about it looking at the same endless ocean that Alexander the Great saw, or Napoleon, or Admiral Halsey. Mm-hmm. That continuity, it really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Puts the moment in perspective.
Precisely. And that sets up the big theme, right?
Right.
The sea's huge influence on everything humans do. That's the thread connecting all the different ocean stories in the book.
Okay, so our first big stop is the Pacific, often called the mother of all oceans because it's just so huge.
Yeah, the scale is mind-boggling.
Stavridis points out its surface area at nearly 64 million square miles is bigger than all the land on Earth combined. It's massive. And that size shaped everything about its history.
And, looking at the bigger picture, he shares this personal story from his first Pacific crossing back in '77.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about just how long the trip was, even on a modern destroyer going from Hawaii to Fiji, then New Zealand, Australia. It really hammers home the vastness that those early Austronesian sailors faced, and later explorers like Magellan.
Right. No GPS back then.
Exactly. Just incredible distances, testing the limits of human endurance and their tech.
And Magellan's voyage, the first European one across, was famously brutal. It really shows how, for centuries, Europeans just had no clue what was west of the Americas until Balboa saw it from that hilltop in Panama, right?
Yeah, back in the 1500s.
And that kicked off this global scramble for colonies. Spain jumped out ahead at first, dominating the trade across the Pacific, shipping silver from the New World to Asia, bringing goods back to Europe.
What's fascinating, though, is how the U.S. eventually got into the Pacific game. It was really driven by the California Gold Rush in 1848, and then the growing need for coaling stations for steamships.
The logistics.
Right. And that need directly led to annexing Hawaii in 1898. Pearl Harbor became this absolutely crucial pivot point for American presence, and that set things up for later interactions with Japan.
Speaking of Japan, Stavridis goes into Commodore Perry's soft power approach in 1853, sailing in with those steamships, gifts.
And a bigger squadron later,
Yeah. Which led to the Treaty of Kanagawa in 54. That opened up Japanese ports, gave refueling rights. And that was really the start of Japan's super fast modernization, becoming a real naval power.
Mm-hmm. They started thinking like Britain, another island nation worried about big continental powers like China and Russia.
And those early wars, the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, the Russo-Japanese War, they showed off Japan's new naval strength. He mentions Admiral Ito's flying squadron, emphasizing speed and maneuverability.
Yeah, but a really crucial point comes up when you think about how naval warfare evolved. The Pacific in World War II became this arena for total war. Technology completely changed things. Aircraft, radars, submarines.
Midway.
Exactly. The Battle of Midway, Japanese planes caught on the carrier decks, switching out bombs for torpedoes. A total catastrophe for them. 4 carriers lost.
Wow.
And Commander Okamiya's quote nails it. The Pacific War was started by men who did not understand the sea and fought by men who did not understand the air. That captures that huge strategic shift perfectly.
So after Midway, the U.S. pushed across the Pacific. Nimitz from the north, MacArthur from the south.
That famous two-pronged advance, yeah, showcasing incredible U.S. industrial power.
And even after the Cold War, the
Yep.
Pacific stayed this economic giant. Trans-Pacific trade overtook transatlantic in the 80s, and that's still the trend. So this whole Pacific Century idea, what's the real takeaway?
Well, zooming out, the Pacific still has major risks. Massive overfishing, pollution. That Texas-sized island of plastic is horrifying, circulating above and below the surface. Plus more intense typhoons from climate change. And geopolitically, it's tense. North Korea's nuclear program, their military spending apparently doubled between 2013 and 2015.
Yeah.
And China's military buildup, advanced jets, that DF-21 carrier killer missile, their own aircraft carriers now. It fuels this ongoing arms race.
But there are opportunities for cooperation, too.
Definitely. Things like the Malabar exercises, bringing U.S., Indian, and Japanese
Yeah.
forces together. It shows cooperation is possible, even necessary.
Okay, let's shift gears. Let's pivot to the Atlantic, which Stavridis calls the cradle of our civilization.
Yeah, the world's second largest ocean. Over 40 million square miles. That's more than 10 times the size of the U.S.
And his first memory is as a little kid, sailing from New York to Athens in the early 60s on one of those huge old cruise liners.
A real throwback, yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing when you think about the history of exploring the Atlantic. You had early guys like St. Brendan, the Irish abbot.
And the Vikings?
Right, the Vikings making voyages in the late 900s, setting up shop in Canada. There's that whole academic debate, did they discover America or just reach it?
Right, the impact on worldview.
Exactly. But ultimately, it was the warmer weather sailors, mainly the Portuguese in the 15th to 16th centuries, who really colonized the Atlantic world and shaped its future.
The Portuguese, yeah. Prince Henry the Navigator pushing technology, the caravels,
Yeah.
enabling those incredible voyages around Africa.
Dias rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama getting to India, Cabral finding Brazil.
These journeys basically knitted together Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia, kicked off the Oceanic Age. Stavridis talks about being enchanted by Lisbon's Belém Tower, that white tower where the voyages started, even as a 4-star admiral decades later.
Which leads us to a big shift in naval warfare strategy. Columbus opened the New World, sure, but it was in the 16th century, with heavily armed national warships like the ones Henry VIII commissioned, that the broadside tactic really came in.
Firing all cannons on one side at once.
Right, changed naval battles for hundreds of years. And the Spanish Armada in 1588 is the classic example. Lighter, faster English ships, better sailors against the bigger Spanish galleons.
God breathed and they were scattered.
Exactly what was on the English victory medals.
So the Atlantic becomes this stage for huge imperial fights. The Dutch were big players for a while.
Remarkable. Yeah, though ultimately less successful against the English.
And the 7 Years' War in the mid-1700s, sometimes called the First Real World War, that showed something crucial. Britain's control of the seas, using blockades, hitting colonies, Pitt's plan was the key to winning wars and grabbing territory like Canada. It wasn't just about winning battles, it was strategic denial.
And if you look at the bigger picture, these Atlantic crossings had massive effects. It wasn't just sailing tech. Think about all the new crops coming back from the Americas.
Potatoes, tomatoes, corn.
Totally changed European diets, helped set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. But this flow of trade and people also fueled colonial wars, made sea control absolutely essential long before Mahan wrote it all down.
Even the American Revolution highlights how critical sea power was. The colonists needed French help to overcome Britain's grip on the Atlantic.
John Paul Jones, right? His famous fight against the Serapis in 79, his ship sinking, but he says, "I've not yet begun to fight."
Classic. Symbolic of the struggle.
But ultimately, Yorktown showed the real value of French sea power. That ability to move troops, block the British. That was decisive for American independence.
And the Atlantic stayed central right through the Napoleonic Wars. Horatio Nelson.
Absolute strategic genius. Trafalgar, October 1805. Shattered Napoleon's plans to invade Britain. Another perfect example of the influence of sea power upon history.
Though Nelson died in the battle,
Yeah.
tragically.
On HMS Victory. Yeah. And Napoleon, ironically, dies exiled on St. Helena, staring out at the Atlantic he could never conquer.
Meanwhile, back in the U.S., you had that ongoing argument. Hamilton and the Federalists wanting a strong navy.
Versus Jefferson's Democratic Republicans favoring coastal forts, gunboats.
And the War of 1812 kind of proved the forts weren't enough. American frigates won some morale boosters, sure, but the British blockade basically choked U.S. trade.
The war ended mostly because Britain just had bigger fish to fry globally. Later in the Civil War, the North's industrial strength, and especially that Atlantic blockade, were key to squeezing the South.
And then technology cooks in again. 19th century steam power makes the Atlantic shrink.
And the transatlantic telegraph cables. Suddenly, messages cross in minutes instead of weeks.
Queen Victoria and President Buchanan swapping telegrams in 1866, hoping for perpetual peace.
Yeah, well, that didn't quite pan out. And then you have the Titanic sinking.
A stark reminder of human arrogance against the power of the sea.
Exactly.
In the 20th century, the Atlantic was ground zero for both world wars, Teddy Roosevelt building up the Navy, the Panama Canal.
Underscoring sea power, yeah. Then German U-boats in WWY and II, those wolf packs showed just how vulnerable shipping was.
Leading to convoys, radar, sonar.
Right. Stavridis vividly describes the peak of sinkings in November 42, 700,000 tons lost in 1 month, until Allied tech and tactics finally turned the tide.
And America's isolationism after World War I, he calls it a terrible harvest leading towards World War II.
A crucial lesson learned, though. After WWII, the U.S. decided not to withdraw, but to stay engaged globally, setting up the UN, Bretton Woods.
Then the Cold War turns the Atlantic into this target-rich zone for sub-hunting between NATO and the Soviets.
And the Falklands War in '82, short but sharp, hammered home another lesson. How vulnerable surface ships are to missiles fired from the air, a lesson navies are still studying today.
Okay, let's sail east to what Stavridis calls the future sea, the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, he describes it as less explored historically, geopolitically, compared to the Atlantic or Pacific, despite being huge. But that's changing fast.
It's India's ocean, really, where a lot of their strategic focus lies.
And the Admiral recounts his first time sailing into it through the Strait of Malacca in the mid-'80s. He was on the USS Valley Forge, an AGI's cruiser, heading to the Arabian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War.
He remembers the Malacca Strait being incredibly crowded.
And just constant tension with Iranian ships once they got into the confined waters of the Gulf.
What about its earlier history? Less known, you said.
Well, a key insight comes from ancient Greek texts, like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. They show trade potential way back then, Red Sea, African coast. And ancient Indian civilizations were sailing these waters as early as the 5th century BC, using the monsoon winds.
But fewer big sea battles compared to the Med.
Right. The Indian Ocean is so vast, open. Warfare was more land-focused. The Arabian Gulf, though, that's different. We call it tight, confined, constrained, and shallow. A uniquely tough place to operate ships.
He specifically mentions sailing the Valley Forge there during Operation Earnest Will, escorting huge oil tankers.
Yeah, tankers 10 times their size. Their high-tech AGI system was vital defense against potential Iraqi or Iranian missile attacks. He said the operational pace there was incredibly high, constant worry about Iranian threats in those tight waters.
And then European exploration hits. Vasco da Gama's voyage, 1497-98.
Building on decades of Prince Henry's work, yeah. Longest voyage out of sight of land up to that point, linking the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Huge achievement.
But Stavridis points out the dark side, too. The massacres da Gama supposedly committed in India, burning pilgrims alive.
A grim stain on that story of exploration, definitely.
Fast forward to the 19th century, the Indian Ocean becomes basically a British lake.
Controlled to protect India, the jewel in the crown. The shift to steam power, and especially the Suez Canal opening in 1869, were huge for maintaining British control and boosting trade, coffee, spices, cotton, tea, rubber, fueling the Industrial Revolution.
But there was a dark side to that trade too, right?
Absolutely. Brutal movement of indentured laborers, basically slavery under another name, and the opium trade from India and Java to China, which led directly to the Opium Wars.
WWI didn't affect the region much, but WWII saw action from Japan, Italy, Germany, and he singles out Singapore.
Calls it a showcase city. Transformed from almost nothing into a powerhouse through, as its leader Lee Kuan Yew put it, and Stavridis met him, discipline, vision, and some tough decisions.
After WWII, the Brits leave. U.S. and Soviets move in, competing for influence, oil, minerals.
And Stavridis talks about the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami response. U.S. military and civilian agencies deploying smart power hospital ships like the Mercy and Comfort, showing the humanitarian aid really can build long-term security.
He also led that counter-piracy mission off East Africa as NATO commander.
Yeah, a really key insight there. This incredible grand nautical coalition, NATO, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, even Iran, all working together against Somali pirates.
Wow, that's quite a lineup.
Shows cooperation is possible, even between rivals, against a common threat. By 2013, piracy was way down. It took warships, convoys, but crucially, also tackling the problems ashore in Somalia nation-building courts.
But now it's popped up again in the Gulf of Guinea.
Right, which highlights that you need to address the root causes on land for these solutions to stick.
So back to that Pacific century idea. Stavridis argues the 21st century is really the Indian Ocean century.
That's his argument, yeah. It's almost a quarter of the world's waters, handles half of all shipping, 70% of all oil, borders nearly 40 nations, over 90% of the world's Muslim population. It's the crossroads of globalization.
So what's the U.S. role then? He lists key actions.
6 main things, yeah. First, recognize the Indian Ocean's importance on the maps, strategically. Second, prioritize ties with India. He sees them as the rising driver, a key democracy. Third, deploy forces there more exercises like Malabar with India and Japan. Fourth, keep up counter-piracy. Fifth, engage on the India-Pakistan and Sunni Shia conflicts. And sixth, stay heavily involved in the Gulf for freedom of navigation.
Okay, let's head west now, into the Mediterranean. About 1 million square miles, 2,400 miles across, but that choke point at Gibraltar is less than 10 miles wide.
And Stavridis makes the bold claim. The Med is where war at sea really began.
Why there specifically?
Well, its geography just bred conflict. It's right in the middle of competing powers. Its sea lanes were invasion roads. And those strategic islands, Sicily, Malta, Crete, were stepping stones for empires.
He mentions his first time sailing a warship into the Med, early 80s, on the carrier USS Forrestal, feeling that sense of history in every port, the unpredictable weather.
Yeah, and he tells that story about talking with a Greek general on Crete, wondering about a hypothetical Minoan Greek empire.
A different twist of the historical DNA, he calls it. How easily history could have gone another way.
It really makes you think. Looking back, you had the Phoenicians, early traders from 3000 BC, linking Med civilizations with India. Carthage becomes a powerhouse. Then the famous clash of civilizations between the Greek city-states and Persia.
Battle of Salamis, 480 BC, Themistocles rallying the outnumbered Greeks.
Against that massive Persian fleet, shows the power of motivation, better tech those faster Greek galleys.
So what about the Romans? They were land-focused at first, right?
Initially, yeah. But during the Punic Wars against Carthage, they realized their coasts were vulnerable, so they built a fleet. And they invented the corvus, that boarding ramp.
Turning sea battles into land fights on decks.
Exactly. Used it to smash the Carthage navy. That mastery of the sea led to Carthage's destruction in 146 BC and set up the Pax Romana, the most peaceful time in the Med's history, because Rome cleared out the pirates.
But peace didn't last forever.
No. After the Western Roman Empire fell, Islam rises, and the Med becomes this fault line between Christian and Muslim powers. The Ottomans push deep into Europe, dominate the eastern and southern Med, enslave Christian sailors.
Until Lepanto in 1571.
Right. The Holy League smashes the Ottoman fleet. A decisive battle that Stavridis says changed history across the Med, halting the Ottoman advance west.
So Christian powers dominate, Britain rises, led by Nelson, grabbing key islands, Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus.
And Nelson's aggressive style, like at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, wiping out Napoleon's Med fleet near Alexandria, this cemented British control through the 19th century.
And the Med stayed crucial in the 20th century.
Absolutely. Churchill's soft underbelly of Europe idea led to the Gallipoli disaster in WWI 1915. Showed how tough amphibious landings are. 500,000 Allied troops, nearly 50% casualties.
Oof.
In WWII, it was a battleground and a vital supply route. British ships constantly fighting to keep the sea lanes open. Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria.
And even after the Cold War, turbulence continued. The Balkans conflicts in the 90s.
Yeah, international interventions, maritime operations, enforcing arms embargoes, providing support. Stavridis shares his own experience commanding the destroyer USS Barry during the Bosnian embargo, working under an excitable British commodore. Highlights how complex modern interventions are not just combat.
And current threats. He mentions ISIS.
Right, trying to infiltrate Europe from Libya via the Med, often hidden among migrants or using small boats. He argues for more NATO presence, better intelligence sharing. It says the Med will stay this fickle and changing geopolitical body of water, needing constant security focus. He even suggests Italy should formally raise it at NATO.
Okay, let's shift again. South China Sea, historically a trading hub, right? Integrating China into the global economy, especially with silver.
But then the British East India Company rises, the Opium Wars happen, starkly showing China's weakness against the growing colonial powers, Britain, France, the Dutch.
And Mahan's ideas influence American strategy here.
Hugely influential. His idea of colonies as coaling stations, forward bases. Teddy Roosevelt loved it, led to a big U.S. presence. Stavridis tells a great story about meeting Vice Admiral John Bulkley.
The WWII hero, PT boats, Medal of Honor.
That's the one. Met him later in his career. Bulkley apparently chewed Stavridis out over a damage control drill failure. Epitomized that combat-ready spirit, the need for constant readiness.
The South China Sea was vital in WWII too, the island-hopping campaign, MacArthur returning to the Philippines in '44.
And the Battle of Leyte Gulf, absolutely decisive, shattered the Japanese fleet, basically turned the South China Sea into an American lake, cutting Japan off from resources. Huge factor in their surrender.
Then during the Cold War, the U.S. kept a strong presence, big bases in the Philippines.
Subic Bay, Clark Airfield, yeah. And the Vietnam War made the South China Sea a major focus. Carrier strikes, coastal operations, huge logistics effort by the Navy.
Stavridis mentions the Tonkin Gulf incident in '64 as the clinching event that deepened U.S. involvement.
Even though there were later doubts about what actually happened. He notes the U.S. ships fired hundreds of rounds at what many thought were just phantom targets.
And the scale of the naval effort in Vietnam was immense.
Almost 2 million sailors served there. The U.S. Navy trained the South Vietnamese Navy into the world's fifth largest by 72 800 ships, 40,000 personnel.
But the war effort faltered. Lack of support back home, casualties, politics, leading to withdrawal.
And that last sad act of the Navy evacuating U.S. supporters from Saigon in the mid-'70s.
So fast forward to today. The South China Sea is still a potential flashpoint.
Stavridis calls it a likely zone of conflict because of China's growing assertiveness, building those artificial islands.
Destroying coral reefs in the process.
Right. John McManus called it the most rapid rate of permanent loss of coral reef area in human history. Plus, China's anti-accessoria denial, or A280 strategy, aiming to keep adversaries out, including that carrier killer missile. And internal pressures in China often fuel nationalism externally.
So what's the U.S. strategy Stavridis recommends?
Maintaining a network of bases and access deals. Philippines, Vietnam's Cam Bay, Singapore, even refueling arrangements with Taiwan. Strengthening ties with countries around the sea through exercises. Pushing economic integration like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a delicate balance, he says. Cooperate when you can, confront when you must, to uphold international law.
Okay, let's hit closer to home now. The Caribbean. Stavridis calls it the part of America's backyard most Americans know very little about.
Yeah, but steeped in history, especially the Spanish conquest.
He talks about Columbus's voyages, initial disappointment finding indigenous cultures, not Asian palaces.
Right, cultures he described as building little beyond subsistence level. And Stavridis reflects on a conversation with his own junior officers back in '93. They pointed out Columbus's voyages mostly meant slavery and death for the locals.
One man's vaunted explorer is another man's genocidal conquistador.
That's the phrase. He calls the Caribbean the accidental sea that quickly became the site of the deliberate and dark scourge of slavery.
Fueled by sugar production, creating that triangular trade.
Bringing enslaved Africans to the Caribbean. And diseases went both ways, devastating indigenous people, but also Europeans. Yellow fever, for instance. Though Africans had more immunity, which ironically increased the demand for slave labor.
Then the Protestant Reformation sparks more rivalries there. England, the Dutch challenging Catholic Spain.
Exactly. You get figures like Sir Francis Drake raiding Spanish ports, Henry Morgan the privateer becoming governor of Jamaica. The Caribbean turns into this nautical Wild West. Pirates, privateers, merchant ships, just like the movies, basically.
Then the Monroe Doctrine comes along in the 1820s, the U.S. saying no more European colonies here.
But initially, the U.S. couldn't really back it up militarily. Later on, though, they intervened a lot, often with the Marines, and they bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917 for $25 million. Strategic position, along with Puerto Rico.
But the Caribbean still faces challenges today.
Big time. The Cold War had flashpoints like the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, the U.S. drawing a line against Soviet missiles. But beyond that, Stavridis sees the region as perpetually stuck in the past. Poverty, slow growth, corruption, violence, especially Haiti, plus the drug trafficking from South America.
So what's the future look like? What does Stavridis suggest?
He says the U.S. needs to ditch that tired and offensive cliche of America's backyard. Instead, embrace a real partnership for the Americas.
Meaning what exactly?
Encourage regional cooperation. revive things like the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which he says is kind of dead, boost security cooperation, which he calls limited, leverage the large Caribbean diasporas living in the U.S., develop a collective strategy. He even floats the idea of internationalizing Guantanamo Bay for humanitarian work, since its combat role is essentially nil.
Interesting idea. Okay, let's head way north now. The Arctic Ocean, changing incredibly fast because of warming.
Yes, Stavridis says by 2040, you'll have open water passage almost year-round, maybe no ice over the North Pole a decade after that. This opens up huge resource potential, but also new, much faster shipping rates.
The Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea Route.
Exactly. But the geopolitics are tricky. The Arctic Council members, US, Norway, Canada, Denmark, all NATO plus Russia as this uneasy partner.
It's a zone of competition.
And Russia sees the Arctic as vital.
Central to their worldview, they're boosting troops, expanding bases all along their huge Arctic coast. It's home to their northern fleet, their nuclear missile subs, and they have way more icebreakers in the U.S., over 30, some nuclear, while the U.S. has maybe one fully functional one.
So it's a delicate balance up there. Cooperation versus competition.
Definitely. A blue north offers potential shipping resources, but huge perils too. Rising tensions, environmental damage from melting ice, and the U.S. lagging behind in engagement and infrastructure compared to Russia.
And it's becoming strategic in other ways too. Yeah, looking at the bigger picture. Long-range missiles from China or North Korea. The shortest path to the U.S. is over the Arctic. So Stavridis pushes for a multifaceted approach. International cooperation via the Arctic Council, better coordination within the U.S. government agencies, and public-private partnerships.
He tells that cool story about U.S. subs surfacing through the ice.
Thrilling anecdote, yeah. Super dangerous, precise maneuver, using sonar to find thin spots, the captain carefully controlling it, hearing the ice crunch on the hull.
Then popping up, checking for damage, crew walking on the ice, avoiding polar bears.
Right. Sometimes the bears walk right up to the sub. It perfectly shows the extreme conditions and the specialized skills needed up there.
Okay, shifting from geography to theme. The Outlaw Sea, crime on the oceans.
Yes, Stavridis highlights that significant criminal activity persists out there. Piracy is ancient, but it's back with modern tools. He oversaw that NATO mission off East Africa.
Somali ex-fishermen attacking huge container ships for ransom peaked around 2009-10.
Over 300 attacks then. Nearly 20 ships, hundreds of sailors held hostage at its peak.
But the international response worked.
He explains why it was successful, and this is a key insight. Yes, warships and convoys helped tactically, but crucially, they also addressed the conditions ashore in Somalia, nation building, setting up judicial systems. That coalition of over 30 nations, including Russia, China, Iran, really reduced piracy by 2013, proves global cooperation can work on these transnational threats, but you need the ashore piece too.
But like you mentioned, it's now popped up in the Gulf of Guinea.
Right, which shows that just suppressing it in one place often pushes it somewhere else. You need sustained, comprehensive solutions, tackling instability, corruption, lack of legal options ashore.
What else falls under the Outlaw Sea?
Overfishing is a huge one. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. Stavridis cites studies saying over 60% of fish stocks need rebuilding. He uses the alarming phrase, oceans are cleared at twice the rate of forests.
Wow, that's critical since over 1 billion people rely on fish for protein.
And it fuels conflict too. Think about clashes over fishing grounds, like involving China's massive fishing fleet caught operating illegally.
But Stavridis says the biggest crime on the high seas is
environmental damage. He talks about his own journey from being a young sailor unknowingly polluting, watching dirty bilge water get pumped out, throwing plastic trash overboard.
Because that was just standard practice back then.
To becoming an expert on the law of the sea and realizing the lasting harm. Oil spills are bad, like Saddam Hussein deliberately dumping 400 million gallons in the Gulf in '91. But even worse, maybe, is the routine pollution. Industrial waste, farm runoff, and especially plastics, which he says chillingly are forever.
So what's the answer?
More international cooperation, stronger enforcement of agreements like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though the U.S. hasn't fully ratified it because of seabed mining issues, and a big public awareness campaign, strategic communications to convince people the oceans aren't an invulnerable dumping ground. They're vital, finite resources we need to protect.
Okay, let's bring it all back home. America's role. Heavily influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan, the big naval strategist. What would Mahan think today? How does Stavridis apply his ideas?
Well, a key insight is Mahan's core principles still hold up. National power comes from the oceans through three things: production, leading to trade, shipping, merchant ships in the Navy, and colonies or alliances for global bases.
And he stressed other conditions too.
Right. Geography, like America's long coastlines, population, not just numbers, but the character of people willing to follow the sea, build ships, join the Navy, and the character of the government's smart leadership that understands and uses sea power effectively.
So how does Stavridis translate that to today's U.S. strategy?
First, the U.S. has to see itself as a maritime nation. Support the merchant marine, a powerful Navy, shipbuilding, fishing, ports, Arctic icebreakers, surveillance. Second, defend the open global commons. Challenge nations like China, trying to claim international waters as their own, building those islands. Third, build strong alliances. Those combined forces, which Stavridis saw firsthand on port visits, are incredibly formidable.
What would surprise Mahan today, though?
Stavridis points out a few big ones. The shift to joint warfare land, sea, air, all tightly integrated. The absolute critical role of cyber warfare information, communications, weapons systems control.
Okay.
The integration of space and unmanned systems, especially GPS, its map the trackless oceans, revolutionized navigation and combat. And finally, something maybe less obvious. Undersea fiber optic cables.
Carrying almost all global communications.
99% of telecommunications, trillions in financial transactions daily. Mahan wouldn't have conceived of that. These cables are vulnerable, so protecting them is a new strategic must. But they also offer promise for new high-speed networks using mobile hubs.
So the bottom line for a 21st century sea power strategy.
Stavridis argues the need for sea power isn't shrinking, it's growing. It's not about downplaying land or air power, but seeing how maritime fits into global security. He wants a larger fleet, arguing quantity has a quality all its own, especially with China and Russia building up their navies. He even suggests an 8th fleet for the Indian Ocean and a 9th for the Arctic.
Adding to the existing numbered fleets.
And the 10th fleet for cyber, yeah. Ultimately, Stavridis reiterates, U.S. strategy has to be built on the absolute ability to control the ocean approaches to our nation. He concludes that America's nautical character, its reliance on the sea for security and prosperity, remains vital, indeed essential, for the country's future.
Wow, what an incredible journey we've taken across the world's oceans today. You've really just plunged into Admiral James Stavridis' sea power, got a sense of how this liquid world shapes everything past, present, future, from ancient Phoenicians to modern cyber threats.
Yeah, we've seen the oceans aren't just routes for trade or war. They're vital ecosystems facing huge challenges from us, from human activity. Stavridis' mix of history, geopolitics, and his own experiences really brings it all to life. It's a unique perspective on global power, truly.
So the next time you look at a map, maybe even just, a glass of water, what new connections will you make about this powerful, often dangerous, but always fascinating world of the oceans?
Maybe it leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If Stavridis is right, if the oceans are really one system, and our nation's future is so tied to them, how might your daily choices, even small ones, actually play a part in protecting and understanding these crucial waterways for the generations coming after us?